At 73 and 71, Arthur and Bess Henley still held hands when they walked, not performatively, not for photographs, not because they were trying to prove something to younger people who didn't believe in long marriages. They held hands because after 49 years of holding each other up through everything the world could throw at two people from nothing, letting go would have felt like forgetting how to breathe. Arthur's hands were rough, scarred across the knuckles from 40 years of carpentry. Bess's were small, strong, and always warm, even in winter. Their hands fit together, the way things fit together when they've been worn into each other by time. They held hands on the morning of October 14th, standing in the kitchen of their son David's house in Ashford, North Carolina, listening to their 3 adult children explain, with the practiced patience of people who had rehearsed this conversation in a group text, why it was time for Arthur and Bess to move into assisted living. "It's not that we don't love you," said David, the oldest at 47, leaning against the granite countertop of a kitchen that had cost more to renovate than Arthur had earned in any 5 years of his life. "It's that this situation isn't sustainable." "We've been talking about it for months," said their daughter, Catherine, 44, who had driven up from Charlotte and was already checking her phone under the table. "All 3 of us agree. It's the responsible thing." "Pine Ridge has an opening," said Michael, the youngest at 40, naming the facility like it was a resort and not a place where people went to become invisible. 2-bedroom unit, meal plan, activities. You'd have everything you need." Arthur and Bess stood side by side in that kitchen, holding hands, and listened to their children describe the remainder of their lives as a logistics problem, a situation, a conversation that had been happening for months without them in it, about them, around them, as if they were furniture that needed to be moved to a different room. Arthur looked at the kitchen, the custom cabinets, the marble countertops, the $4,000 refrigerator with the screen on the front. He'd helped David build his first treehouse when the boy was 8. He'd taught him how to measure twice and cut once, how to swing a hammer, how to read a level. Now David stood in a kitchen that cost $90,000 and couldn't look his father in the eye. "How much is Pine Ridge?" Arthur asked. His voice was quiet. We'd learned decades ago that quiet voices carry farther than loud ones. David cleared his throat. $6,400 a month. "For both of us?" "Each." $12,800 a month. $153,600 a year. More than Arthur had earned annually for most of his working life. Now, the price of being stored. "And who pays for that?" Bess asked. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has texture. Catherine looked at David. David looked at Michael. Michael looked at the floor. "We'd split it 3 ways," David finally said, "but we'd need to use the equity from your house." Their house? The house on Keller Road that Arthur had built with his own hands in 1982. The house where all 3 children had been born, where Bess had planted a garden every spring for 42 years, where Arthur had spent every weekend maintaining and improving and caring for a structure the way you care for a living thing, because to him it was. They wanted to sell the house, divide the equity among themselves to offset the cost, and put Arthur and Bess in a facility. "No," Arthur said. "Dad." "I said no." "You're being unreasonable," Catherine said, and the word landed in the kitchen like a slap. Unreasonable. A 73-year-old man who'd built houses for 4 decades, who'd raised 3 children, who'd never missed a mortgage payment or a school play or a little league game, was being unreasonable for declining to be packaged and shipped to a facility so his children could sell his home. "What are you going to do?" Michael asked. "The house needs a new roof. The heating system is from 2003. You can't keep maintaining it." "We'll figure it out," Bess said, and her voice had the same quiet force as Arthur's. Two people who'd spent 49 years communicating in shorthand, who could have an entire conversation in a glance. "You'll figure it out," David repeated, and the skepticism in his voice was worse than cruelty, because it came from a place that genuinely couldn't imagine his parents figuring anything out. To David, his parents were already old, already diminished, already past the point where their decisions deserved respect. He saw a 73-year-old man with arthritis in his knees and a 71-year-old woman with high blood pressure and concluded, as the world always concludes about the elderly, that the warranty had expired. If you've ever been looked at by your own family and seen pity where there should have been respect, if you've ever had your autonomy discussed in a room you weren't invited to, if you've ever been told that the life you built was no longer sustainable by people who wouldn't know how to build a birdhouse, then this story belongs to you. Welcome to Hearts Don't Rust. Subscribe now, because what Arthur and Bess built on that mountain with their own hands at 73 and 71 years old didn't just prove their children wrong. It became something so extraordinary that the very people who called them a burden drove 4 hours up a dirt road just to see it with their own eyes. Arthur Dean Henley was born in 1953 in a 2-room house outside Boone, North Carolina, the kind of house that didn't have indoor plumbing until Arthur was 9 and didn't have a telephone until he was 14. His father, Dean Henley, was a logger who worked the Blue Ridge timber operations until a falling tree took his left arm in 1967. After that, Dean made chairs. One-armed, sitting on the porch of that 2-room house, he turned ash and oak and cherry into chairs so beautiful that people drove from 3 counties away to buy them. He charged $40 each. He should have charged $400. He died in 1989 with $3,200 in savings and a porch full of sawdust and the knowledge that he'd never once made anything ugly. Arthur inherited his father's hands and his father's stubbornness, but not, thankfully, his father's willingness to undercharge. Arthur started Henley Custom Carpentry in 1978 at the age of 25, working out of a van with $600 in tools. He built cabinets and porches and additions and eventually entire houses. He was good. Not famous, not rich, but good in the way that matters, the way that makes a door close with a solid click and a floor stay level for 40 years, and a staircase feel like it grew there instead of being built. He met Bess Caldwell at a church picnic in 1975. Bess was 19, small, dark-haired, with a laugh that sounded like someone had opened a window in a stuffy room. She worked at the Watauga County Library, shelving books and running the Children's Reading Hour, and being the kind of quietly essential person that holds communities together the way mortar holds stones. She read everything: novels, histories, farming manuals, survival guides, cookbooks. She absorbed information the way dry wood absorbs rain, and she never forgot anything she'd read. They married in September of 1977. The ceremony was at Bess's family church. 32 guests, a reception in the fellowship hall with a cake Bess's mother made, and a fiddle player Arthur hired for $25. They spent their honeymoon driving the Blue Ridge Parkway in Arthur's truck, stopping wherever the view was beautiful, sleeping in the truck bed under quilts Bess's grandmother had sewn. It was the best week of Arthur's life, and he said so every anniversary for 49 years. They built the house on Keller Road together. Arthur did the framing, roofing, plumbing, and electrical. Bess did the finishing work, the painting, the trim, the cabinet hardware, the details that make a house feel like a home instead of a structure. It took them 14 months, working evenings and weekends while Arthur ran the carpentry business during the day. The house cost $31,000 in materials. Every penny was earned, nothing borrowed. Arthur hated debt the way his father had hated waste, with a moral certainty that went beyond preference into identity. David was born in 1979, Catherine in 1982, Michael in 1986. 3 children in a house built by their parents' hands, surrounded by mountains and garden rows, and the sound of Arthur's table saw in the shop out back, and Bess's voice reading to them every night before bed. Bess raised the children the way she did everything, thoroughly and without fanfare. She packed lunches with notes tucked inside. She drove carpool. She volunteered at the school library. She kept a garden that produced enough vegetables to feed the family from June through November, and she canned the surplus in mason jars that lined the basement shelves in neat, labeled rows. Pickles, tomatoes, green beans, apple butter, peach preserves. Bess's pantry was a fortress against uncertainty, and she maintained it with the discipline of a general. Arthur was there for everything, too. He coached Little League until his knees couldn't take the crouching. He taught all 3 children how to use basic tools, how to change a tire, how to read weather, how to build a fire. He took them camping in the Blue Ridge every summer, sleeping in tents he'd sewn himself from canvas and paracord, cooking over fires they built together, pointing out constellations from sleeping bags, while coyotes called from the ridgelines. The children grew up and left. This is what children do, and Arthur and Bess expected it. David got an engineering degree, married a woman named Laura, who came from money, and moved to Ashford, where he earned $180,000 a year designing commercial HVAC systems. Catherine got a business degree, married a financial advisor named Greg, and settled in Charlotte, where their combined income exceeded $300,000. Michael, the youngest, got a computer science degree, stayed unmarried, moved to Raleigh, and worked for a tech company that paid him more per month than Arthur had earned in most years. The children visited less, then barely. Arthur and Bess adjusted. They had each other. They had the house, they had the garden and the mountains, and the particular peace that comes from having built a life with your own hands and not owing anything to anyone. Then Arthur's knees started going. Osteoarthritis, the doctor said, common in men who'd spent decades on job sites, climbing ladders, crouching under cabinets. He could still walk, still work, but the bad days came more often and lasted longer. Bess's blood pressure crept up. She managed it with medication and the same disciplined approach she applied to everything. But the children noticed. They noticed the way people notice things about their parents, not with concern, but with calculation. How much longer? How much will this cost? What's the plan? The plan, apparently, was Pine Ridge. Arthur and Bess drove home from David's house in silence. Not angry silence, thinking silence. The Blue Ridge Mountains rose on their left, deep green against the October sky, and the leaves were turning the way they do every year, as if the mountains were proving that getting older doesn't mean getting less beautiful. When they got home, Arthur sat in his shop and looked at his hands, the hands that had built this house, the hands that had built 200 other houses, the hands that his children had decided were no longer capable of taking care of themselves. Bess found him there an hour later. She stood in the doorway and said, "I'm not going to Pine Ridge, Arthur." "I know. And we're not selling this house." "I know that, too. So what are we going to do?" Arthur looked at her. This woman he'd loved for 49 years. This woman who could preserve enough food to survive a winter, who could identify every edible plant on a mountainside, who had read more books than anyone he'd ever met, who was stronger at 71 than most people ever are. "Remember the cabin?" he said. Bess smiled. It was the first time she'd smiled in 3 days. The cabin was a structure Arthur had built 30 years earlier, in 1996, on a piece of land he'd bought for $1,200 at a tax auction. 12 acres at the end of a Forest Service road, 4,200 feet up on the shoulder of Roan Mountain, accessible only by a dirt track that washed out every spring and froze every winter. He'd built the cabin as a weekend project, a place to hunt and fish and sit in silence. It was small, maybe 600 square feet, one room with a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace, a porch that looked out over a valley so deep and green that standing on it felt like standing on the edge of the world. The cabin had no electricity, no plumbing, no phone line, no internet. It had a spring-fed water source 200 yards uphill, a wood stove, a hand-dug root cellar, and 12 acres of mixed hardwood forest, with a small meadow that caught morning sun. Arthur had maintained it casually over the decades, replacing boards when they rotted, patching the roof when it leaked. It was solid, but primitive. The kind of place most people would call a shack. Arthur called it freedom. 2 weeks after the conversation in David's kitchen, Arthur and Bess sold the house on Keller Road. Not to the children, to a young couple from Winston-Salem who'd been looking for a fixer-upper in the mountains. Arthur sold it for $165,000 below market value, because the young couple reminded him of himself and Bess 40 years earlier, full of energy and plans and no idea what they were getting into. They didn't tell the children. They loaded Arthur's truck with tools, supplies, clothing, and 200 jars of Bess's canned goods. They hitched a small utility trailer carrying a wood stove, a hand pump, building materials, and the 2 rocking chairs Dean Henley had made before he died. And on a cold morning in early November, with frost on the windshield and the mountains sharp against a sky the color of steel, they drove away from Ashford and into the Blue Ridge. The children didn't notice for 6 days. David called the house on Keller Road on a Tuesday to discuss Pine Ridge logistics and got a disconnected number. He drove over on Wednesday and found a young couple painting the kitchen. It took another 2 days for all 3 children to piece together what had happened. Their parents had sold the house, kept the money, told nobody, and disappeared. "They can't just vanish," Catherine said on a conference call with her brothers. "They're 73 and 71. This is irresponsible. This is dangerous." "Where would they even go?" Michael asked. David was quiet for a moment. Then, "The cabin." "That shack on the mountain? That's not. They can't live there. There's no electricity. There's no water. They'll die up there." "Should we call someone?" Catherine asked. "Adult Protective Services?" "And tell them what?" David said. "That our mentally competent parents made a decision we don't like." That was the moment, though none of them recognized it, when the story stopped being about Arthur and Bess and started being about 3 adult children, reckoning with the fact that the people they dismissed as burdens had just proven they were anything but. Arthur and Bess arrived at the cabin on November 4th. The road was bad. The last 3 miles took an hour, the truck grinding through ruts and washouts, the trailer bouncing dangerously behind them. Bess held the dashboard with one hand and Arthur's arm with the other, and said nothing, because some situations don't need words. They need trust. The cabin was exactly as they'd left it, small, solid, cold. The stone fireplace was intact. The roof had a leak in one corner that Arthur noted for repair. The sleeping loft was dusty but dry. Mouse droppings on the floor, cobwebs in every corner, a bird's nest in the eaves. But the walls were plumb. The floor was level. The foundation stones Arthur had set 30 years ago hadn't moved a millimeter. He'd built this cabin the way his father had built chairs, with the understanding that doing something right the first time means never having to apologize for it later. They unloaded the truck in silence, working together the way they'd worked together for 49 years, with an efficiency that comes from knowing where the other person will be before they get there. Arthur carried the heavy things. Bess organized where they went. By nightfall, the cabin had a fire in the wood stove, a bed made up in the loft, food on the table, and 2 rocking chairs on the porch facing the valley. That first night, they sat on the porch in Dean Henley's rocking chairs and looked at stars so dense and bright that the sky looked like a cracked ceiling with light pouring through. The temperature was 28 degrees. Their breath made clouds in the air. The mountains were black against the stars, and the silence was so complete that Arthur could hear Bess's heartbeat, or maybe it was his own, and he couldn't tell the difference any more. "Are you scared?" Bess asked. "No," Arthur said. "Are you?" "A little, but the good kind of scared, the kind that means you're about to find out what you're made of." Arthur reached over and took her hand. "I already know what we're made of." The first month was survival, not dramatic survival, not cinematic, not the kind that makes for thrilling stories. The grinding, unglamorous survival of 2 elderly people making a primitive cabin habitable in winter. Arthur fixed the roof leak first, climbing up on a cold November morning with replacement shingles he'd brought from town, his knees protesting every rung of the ladder. He sealed the windows, replaced rotted boards in the floor, reinforced the sleeping loft with additional joists. He installed the new wood stove, running the chimney pipe through a fire-safe sleeve in the wall. He built shelves, a proper kitchen counter, storage racks, a firewood box next to the door. His arthritis screamed at him every morning, and he ignored it every morning because stopping wasn't an option. Bess handled everything else. She organized the food stores, setting up the root cellar with military precision, rotating the canned goods by date, calculating how many calories they needed daily, and how long their supply would last. She found the spring source, cleared the pipe Arthur had run years earlier, and got clean water flowing into a holding tank he'd rigged above the kitchen counter, gravity-fed, with a spigot. She set up a wash station outside the cabin for laundry, heating water on the wood stove and carrying it in buckets. She identified the edible plants growing wild on the property, ramps in the lower woods, chickweed and dandelion in the meadow, black walnuts from a grove near the spring, wild ginger along the creek. She cataloged everything in a notebook, the same way she'd cataloged library books for 35 years. They worked from dawn to dark, 7 days a week. Arthur lost 15 pounds in the first month. Bess's blood pressure, checked weekly with a battery-operated monitor, dropped 20 points. Their bodies were tired in ways they hadn't been tired since their 30s, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from purpose instead of despair. By December, the cabin was warm, weather-tight and organized. The firewood stack under the porch overhang was 6 feet deep, enough to last through March. The root cellar held enough food for 4 months. The water system worked. Arthur had built an outhouse 50 yards from the cabin, properly ventilated, and surprisingly comfortable for what it was. Bess had sewn insulated curtains for the windows from fabric and batting she'd brought from home. At night, with the wood stove burning and the curtains drawn and lantern light making the log walls glow amber, the cabin felt less like a shack and more like a vessel. A small, warm vessel riding out the winter on the shoulder of a mountain, with 2 people inside who had finally stopped being managed by the world and started managing themselves. They didn't call the children. They didn't send letters. They didn't post on social media because they'd never had social media, which their children had always treated as a character flaw rather than a choice. They simply lived, day after day, in a rhythm that felt like something remembered rather than something new. Arthur built, Bess organized. They ate together, worked together, sat on the porch together when the weather allowed, and slept side by side in the loft, warmer than they'd been in years, because the sleeping loft sat directly above the wood stove and trapped the rising heat like a cocoon. In January, Arthur began expanding, not because they needed more space, but because his hands needed work, the way Bess's mind needed books. He added a covered porch extension, doubling the outdoor living space. He built a proper workshop attached to the side of the cabin. Using lumber he milled himself from deadfall trees on the property, with a handsaw and a level, and the same patience his father had used to build chairs. In the workshop, he started making things. Small things at first, a cutting board for Bess, a shelf for her books, a birdhouse, then larger things, a table, a set of chairs, a cabinet with dovetail joints so precise you couldn't fit a piece of paper between them. In February, Bess started planning the garden. She'd brought seed packets from Keller Road, dozens of varieties she'd been saving for years, heirloom tomatoes and pole beans and squash and herbs and flowers. She marked out beds in the meadow, calculating sun exposure and drainage from decades of gardening experience. She started seedlings in jars on the cabin's south-facing windowsill, using soil she'd prepared in the root cellar where the temperature stayed constant. By March, they had visitors, not the children, a neighbor. The word neighbor was generous. Harlan Bishop lived 5 miles down the mountain in a house that made the cabin look like a palace. A man of 68 who'd been living off-grid since the 1990s and knew every creek, trail, and edible plant within 20 miles. Harlan had seen smoke from the cabin's chimney, which hadn't smoked in years, and came to investigate. He found 2 elderly people who had done in 4 months what most people couldn't do in 4 years. A weather-tight cabin, a stocked root cellar, a functioning water system, a workshop producing furniture that Harlan, who'd built his own house, recognized immediately as exceptional work. "You're Arthur Henley," Harlan said, looking at the dovetail joints on the cabinet. "I've seen your work in houses around Watauga County. I always wondered what happened to you." "I'm right here," Arthur said. Harlan became their link to the world below the mountain. He brought news, occasional supplies, and the specific kind of respect that comes from one self-sufficient person recognizing another. He also brought a truck when Arthur started producing furniture in quantities that exceeded what the cabin needed. Harlan drove Arthur's chairs and tables and cabinets to a consignment shop in Banner Elk, where they sold for prices that made Arthur uncomfortable. $350 for a chair, Arthur said when Harlan reported the first sale. "It's a handmade Henley chair." People in Banner Elk pay $350 for a pair of shoes. Your father would have charged $40. You're not your father. Arthur's furniture sold, not in volume, not enough to make him wealthy, but enough to keep money coming in, $1,500 to $2,000 a month, which combined with their Social Security was more than they needed. They had no mortgage, no car payments, no utilities, no insurance premiums except Medicare. Their monthly expenses totaled roughly $400, most of it for things they couldn't produce themselves: medications, batteries, lamp oil, the occasional bag of flour or sugar. For the first time in their adult lives, Arthur and Bess Henley were accumulating money instead of spending it. Spring came to the mountain, the way spring always comes to the Blue Ridge, slowly and then all at once, like a woman who's been thinking about what to wear and finally makes up her mind. The meadow turned green in April. Bess's seedlings went into the ground in early May. By June, the garden was producing, and by July, it was producing more than 2 people could eat. Bess canned the surplus the way she'd always canned, and the root cellar, which had been carefully rationed all winter, began filling again with fresh stores. Arthur built a chicken coop, 8 hens, purchased from a farm supply in Spruce Pine. Bess built cold frames for extending the growing season. Arthur installed a rain collection system, 3 55-gallon barrels fed by gutters he'd fashioned from tin sheeting, providing backup water for the garden during dry spells. Every problem was a project. Every project was a conversation between 2 people who'd been solving problems together for half a century. In August, 1 year after they'd vanished, a car appeared on the dirt road. Not Harlan's truck, a black BMW covered in dust, its suspension clearly not designed for Forest Service roads. Arthur was in the workshop. Bess was in the garden. They both stopped what they were doing and watched the car approach. David got out. He was alone. He'd driven 4 hours from Ashford, the last 90 minutes, on increasingly terrible roads, and his face had the expression of someone who'd been expecting to find wreckage, and instead found something that defied every expectation he'd carried up the mountain. The cabin was unrecognizable from the structure he vaguely remembered from childhood camping trips. The new porch wrapped around 2 sides, covered with the rocking chairs and a hand-built bench. The workshop was solid and neat, with finished furniture visible through the open door. The garden covered a 1/4 acre of the meadow, rows of vegetables and herbs and flowers in full August bloom. Chickens scratched in a well-built coop. The rain barrels gleamed. Smoke rose from the chimney. The entire property had the feeling of a place that was alive and cared for, a place where competence lived. Bess stood up from the garden. She had dirt on her knees and a basket of tomatoes on her arm. She looked, David realized, with a shock that went through him like cold water, younger than she had a year ago. Thinner, stronger, her skin browned from sun, her eyes clear. She didn't look like a woman who needed assisted living. She looked like a woman who had been waiting her entire life for someone to stop telling her what she couldn't do. "Hello, David," she said. "Mom, He stopped. He looked at the garden, the cabin, the mountains stretching to the horizon. "I've been trying to find you for months." "We weren't hiding," Arthur said, emerging from the workshop, wiping sawdust from his hands. "We just didn't need to be found." David stood in the yard of his parents' mountain cabin and felt something collapse inside him, not dramatically, quietly, the way a wall falls when you remove the single belief holding it up. For a year he'd imagined his parents cold, hungry, struggling, regretting their decision. He'd imagined calling Adult Protective Services. He'd imagined the phone call he'd get someday from a hospital or a sheriff. He'd imagined himself as the responsible one, the adult in the room, the son who tried to do the right thing for parents who were too stubborn to accept help. Instead, he found two people who didn't need his help, who had never needed his help, who had built, at 73 and 71, a life that was more functional, more purposeful, and more self-sufficient than anything David had ever managed with his $180,000 salary and his $90,000 kitchen. Can I see inside?" David asked. "Of course," Bess said. "I'll make coffee." The cabin tour lasted an hour. David walked through the space like a man visiting a museum. The efficient kitchen with its gravity-fed water and cast-iron cookware. The sleeping loft, warm and snug. The root cellar, stocked with hundreds of jars in labeled rows. The workshop, where half-finished furniture showed the kind of craftsmanship David hadn't seen since childhood, since the days when his father's hands were the most capable things in his world, and he'd believed that nothing those hands built could ever fail. "The chairs sell for $350 each in Banner Elk," Arthur said matter-of-factly. David, whose HVAC designs earned $180,000 a year, but whose hands couldn't build a bookshelf, said nothing. They ate dinner on the porch. Bess served vegetable soup from the garden, bread she'd baked in a Dutch oven on the wood stove, butter from a dairy farm Harlan had connected them with, and apple cobbler made from wild apples Bess had found on the property. The food was extraordinary, not restaurant extraordinary, real extraordinary, the kind of extraordinary that comes from ingredients pulled from the ground that morning and cooked by a woman who had been feeding people with love and skill for 49 years. "I'm sorry," David said, somewhere between the soup and the cobbler, looking out at the valley turning gold in the sunset. "For the Pine Ridge conversation, for calling you—" He stopped. "A burden," Bess finished gently. "We never use that word." "You didn't have to. You used unsustainable, brah. You used not practical. You used irresponsible. They all mean the same thing, David. They all mean we had become inconvenient to you." David looked at his mother, at her clear eyes and her sun-browned hands, and the quiet authority of a woman who had just served him the best meal he'd eaten in a year from a kitchen with no electricity. "You were never inconvenient," he said. We didn't know what else to do." "You could have asked us," Arthur said. "You could have asked what we wanted instead of telling us what we needed." David drove down the mountain the next morning. He came back 2 weeks later with Catherine. Catherine cried when she saw the garden. She had no frame of reference for what her parents had accomplished because she had never been asked to accomplish anything with her hands. Her life was meetings and spreadsheets and the particular kind of productivity that produces nothing you can touch. Michael came a month after that. He brought his laptop and spent the first hour looking for a Wi-Fi signal before he realized there wasn't one. And then he sat on the porch for 3 hours and didn't check his phone once, which might have been the longest he'd gone without a screen since he was 15. None of them mentioned Pine Ridge. None of them suggested selling anything. None of them used words like sustainable or practical or responsible. They ate Bess's food and sat in Arthur's chairs and watched the mountains do what mountains do, which is stand there and remind you that the world existed before your problems and will exist after them. Over the following months, the children came back, not because they were asked, because they wanted to. David brought his wife Laura, who spent a weekend learning to can vegetables from Bess and went home with 12 jars of pickles and a respect for her mother-in-law she'd never felt before. Catherine brought her daughters, 16 and 14, who complained for the first hour about the lack of internet and spent the remaining 47 hours following Arthur around the workshop, learning to use a hand plane, making their first cutting boards, and asking questions about trees and wood and joints that they'd never thought to ask in their entire lives. Michael came alone repeatedly, and on his fourth visit he helped Arthur build a new storage shed, working in silence for 6 hours and discovering that manual labor produced a different kind of satisfaction than code. Arthur and Bess never asked for an apology. They never mentioned the kitchen conversation. They never used their self-sufficiency as a weapon or their success as a rebuke. They simply lived the way they'd always lived, with competence and grace and the quiet understanding that the best argument is not an argument at all. It's a life well built. The cabin on Roan Mountain stands today against the Blue Ridge sky, like something that grew there, which in a sense it did, grown from the hands and the will and the love of two people who refused to be warehoused. The porch has 4 rocking chairs now, the original 2 from Dean Henley, and 2 more Arthur built for visitors. The garden feeds not just Arthur and Bess, but Harlan and 2 other mountain families who trade venison and honey and firewood for Bess's vegetables and Arthur's furniture repairs. The workshop produces chairs and tables and cabinets that sell in 3 consignment shops across 2 counties, and Arthur still thinks $350 for a chair is too much, and Harlan still tells him it isn't enough. On clear evenings, Arthur and Bess sit on the porch and hold hands and watch the light leave the valley in layers, gold to orange to purple to black, and the stars come out one at a time, like the universe is remembering its own name. They are 74 and 72 now. Arthur's knees still hurt. Bess still takes her blood pressure medication. They are not young. They are not invincible. They know that someday this mountain will be too much for them, and when that day comes, they'll deal with it. But they'll deal with it together, on their own terms, in their own time, and nobody will make the decision for them. "Any regrets?" Arthur asked one evening, the same question he'd asked on their honeymoon and every anniversary since. Bess looked at the mountains, at the garden, at the cabin he'd built, and the life she'd organized, and the stars that belonged to nobody and everybody. "I regret we didn't do this sooner," she said. Arthur squeezed her hand. "We did it exactly when we needed to. My heart overflows with gratitude that you stayed with Arthur and Bess through every moment of their quiet, extraordinary journey, from the granite kitchen where their children called them a burden to the mountain porch, where they proved that the strongest structures are always built by the people the world underestimates. If their story touched something deep inside you, if you've ever been told you're too old to start something new, if you've ever been talked about in rooms you weren't invited to, if you've ever wanted to walk away from people who managed you and walk toward a life you managed yourself, then leave just one word in the comments. One word that captures what you felt when Arthur and Bess drove up that mountain road and never looked back. Because their story proves something that no conference call and no kitchen renovation and no $6,400 a month facility can ever replicate. That competence doesn't expire. That love built with hands lasts longer than love bought with money. That the people who call you a burden are often the ones who've forgotten how to carry their own weight. That it's never too late to build something real. And that the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's a life so well lived that the people who doubted you drive 4 hours up a dirt road just to sit on your porch and eat your soup and remember what they forgot. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that their hands still work, that their mind still matters, that the mountain is still there waiting for anyone brave enough to climb it. Because together we prove that hearts don't rust, that strong hands never lose their grip, and that sometimes the greatest home is the one you build after everyone tells you it's time to stop building. Welcome to our family. We'll see you in the next story.